Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for zooming in from various patches of the planet. I'm really happy to have you with us today to share one of the true joys of our work with the collaborative. Um, we launched the collaborative on global children's issues at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in September 2021. Our goal was to foster cross-disciplinary research and dialogue on critical and emerging issues affecting children around the world, with a particular focus on children experiencing adversity, but also discovering pathways to their resilience. One of our core beliefs at the collaborative is that some of the most important learning about child protection is happening on the ground. It's with the communities that are doing whatever they can to respond to children facing a range of challenges. And these frontline responses are often very innovative. They're usually underfunded, sometimes not funded at all. And our goal at the collaborative is to understand them better, to lift them up, to shine a light on them, and to bring the learning and the questions and the recommendations back into the university context, to Washington, D.C., and into the global community of scholars, practitioners, and policymakers who are committed to doing child-centered work in the world. So our goals with the collaborative is to commit to creating opportunities that are truly child-centered, that are grounded in the lived experiences of children, their families, and communities, that are responsive to current and emerging needs and useful to actors working in a variety of contexts and capacities to meet them. Always informed and solutions oriented, and building effective bridges between stakeholders involved in practice, policy, and research. It's important to note that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in the world, affirms the right to children's participation in all matters that affect them. And we believe that this includes research, and it includes policy, and it includes practice. So our conversation partners today are the research fellows working around the world with the collaborative, and they are exemplars of this commitment to children's participation. Their work is not easy, but it's truly inspiring, and I'm excited to introduce them to you today. We have others who are part of the collaborative who are not on the screen today. That includes Dr. Joan Lombardi, who's a senior research fellow with the collaborative. She helped found it with me. And Sweta Shah is a research fellow who is also part of this team. She wasn't able to join today, but she did do a webinar a few weeks ago presenting her new book. So we'll share a link to that as well in the chat. So I'm going to start by welcoming you, Mara, Vlad, Stephen, Gabriela, and maybe we can talk about what brought you into this child-centered work. Stephen, can I start with you?
Sure. So it's wonderful to be here. So I'm Stephen. I'm originally from Uruguay. And the last 25 years, I've worked in programs with children, families, impacted by violence, by conflict. By training, I'm a therapist, a social worker. I also have a law degree. I've worked in the international humanitarian space. I've worked in West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, always on programs with unaccompanied, separated children, pre-conflict, post-conflict, in the midst of conflict, including, for example, in 2006, the Israel-Hezbollah war. I've also worked in the United States. I've worked in the New York City child welfare system. And that has been sort of my journey. And where I am right now is half of my life is as a family therapist. The other half is I work with different organizations, whether domestically or internationally, including, for example, the US government on unaccompanied children on the border, whether working here in New York City with supporting initiatives for young people leaving the child welfare system, or looking at global issues connected to child sexual abuse and restorative justice, and other similar type issues. But it's just fantastic to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation and to the questions from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. He didn't mention his work related to child rights and religion, but we'll get to that in another webinar. Clearly a wide background. Vlad, greetings. Welcome to this conversation from Ukraine. What brought you to this work?
Thank you, Gillian. Good morning to all. I am Vlad. I am a researcher from Kiev, from Ukraine. And my research focus is considered in forcible deportation and militarization and the problem of Russification of Ukrainian children when Russia soldiers and Russia government try to take away from Ukrainian children to Russia, and what they do with these children after that. This research I started after a full-scale invasion in Ukraine in 2022, when Russia army of Russian Federation started war against Ukraine. Before full-scale invasion, I worked as a researcher in history and in religion studies, and working with my PhD thesis about a role of Catholic Church during World War II, and about what relationships have Catholic bishops with Jewish community in Second World War II. But after that, after war came to Ukraine, I'm try to find all available sources what could be helpful to Ukraine in defending its independence. And as a specialist in religion, I have several contacts in church, and we have a collaboration with a charity foundation, Caritas, named Caritas, and we began transferring food and medicine to Ukrainian children who are living in war zone. And after that, I began researching a problem of mass deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia. Why they do this criminal practice, how many children are involving in this process, who are involving from Russian governments in this process, and I'm trying to collect a lot of information about that, and many of international and Ukrainian media share information about new evidence about this criminal practice. For example, we know about evidence that Russian army deported children from Donetsk region, from Crimea, from Kherson region, and we try to collect this information and try to identify this information about who especially Ukrainian children are taken away from Ukraine to Russia. And that's why I'm still continue investigating this problem and to try to share this important information to international society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Yeah, it's extraordinary to think that, you know, Vlad came into this work studying history and then got caught up in the living history, right? I mean, the fact that history is repeating itself. So really helpful putting what's happening now also into a historical context, noting that this isn't the first time that this has happened to Ukrainian children. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Gabriela.
Hi there. Good morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. My name is Gabriela Sanchez, and I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. And I came into this work for kind of like an unusual pathway as well. I was actually a law enforcement officer on the US-Mexico border. For 7 years, I was involved in the identification and prosecution of cases, of criminal cases that were related to migration. And that was, I was part of the jurisdiction, or the first jurisdiction, that introduced a statute against migrant smuggling, that is the facilitation of border crossings for profit along the U.S.-Mexico border. And the work from the U.S.-Mexico border was an experience that allowed me, or that I was able to translate and to take to other places around the world. I've conducted work along North Africa, Europe, and Australia, also looking at the facilitation of border crossings. But I actually started to look into the participation of young people when, as part of the testimonies of survival and resistance of people as they were crossing borders, they started to mention young guides, teenagers, primarily boys, that were guiding them across the border, that were encouraging them, that were carrying their bags, or that they were helping them hide, or reach a destination. And at that point, a lot of people told me, like, well, we cannot really talk about children because we're not supposed to do research about children. But I started to become more and more concerned about how not taking into consideration the perspectives of young people was obscuring a lot of the dynamics that were actually occurring on the ground related to migration facilitation. And that's how I ended up here. So very, very excited to be here. And thanks to all of you for joining.
Thank you, Gabriela. Yeah, it's so fascinating to just see the different ways you've entered the space from different angles, which I think is one thing I love about the work that we're doing in our field, is that it is so multidisciplinary and there's so many different points of access, and that we kind of need each other, right? To whether we're entering from, a historical perspective or a therapy perspective or a policy perspective, or just living on the border and being interested. There's so many ways to come in, and we need these diverse perspectives as we crack these difficult nuts, right, that are affecting children. Mara.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Like Stephen, I come from the southern cone of South America, so from Argentina. I am initially in the middle and finally from Argentina, so my Argentine identity is very strong. And the reason why I started working on children's rights, or I became interested in this, that I have said it before in a Q&A with Georgetown, so I can share it too, is my admiration for teenagers and very young people that were murdered during our latest dictatorship, who were activists, union leaders, students, etc., and who were activists so that other children and future generations would have a more equal society and more just society, unlike the one that we have now, since Argentina is an extremely unequal and just country. Besides children, I take an interest in women's rights because, as we know, women and teenagers, girls, are the main caregivers of children worldwide, so statistically, and it is the same in Latin America. So after my work in children that focused mainly on international advocacy mechanisms, I realized that it was important also to expand my interest into other minorities and into other groups that are being oppressed, at least in our societies. So thank you very much for being here, and I am looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mara. We're going to continue with you. I think we'll now get in a little bit more into depth into the projects that you're working on now. So we'll stick with you, Mara, since I think we're in this conversation, we're going to follow a little bit the migration pathway, because three of you are specifically working on children on the move between South America, Central America, and the United States. And then Vlad is, of course, also dealing with children on the move, but forcibly displaced and deported. So we'll start with the United States, and then we're going to move back over to Ukraine, and you can feel the links between these global phenomenon. So Mara, over to you. There's growing consensus that global development and humanitarian assistance must become more responsive to the needs and priorities of local actors and communities and embrace their ideas about how to address the challenges they face. And your work has currently specifically focuses on learning from communities experiencing displacement and migration in Guatemala and their efforts to support early childhood development and protection for young children on the move. We don't often hear about that. So what are you learning from these frontline innovators, and how can international organizations, whether it's USAID or large international non-governmental organizations and donors, incorporate this kind of learning into their initiatives to support local actors?
Yes. So I will give an answer and explain what we are doing at the same time, because the reason why I decided to focus on Guatemala, as you know, originally the project was about the Northern Triangle, but I don't agree with addressing the whole South region like if it was one single country, which is what ends up happening sometimes. And Guatemala is the scenario of a neglected crisis because of different reasons. First is the interest in people on the move across the America in the past decade, in the past years, in the past decade, that led the situation of internally displaced Guatemalans to be a little bit neglected. The same Guatemalans that are returned after living in the US or trying to cross the border, or after living in Mexico, and who are trying to reintegrate into their societies. This overlaps with long-standing discrimination against indigenous peoples, because we know this in the areas where I did field work, that is the Western Highlands. Most migrants internationally are indigenous people, so Mayan ethnic peoples, let's say. And that's why we decided to focus on this. So on different topics that have been neglected by international cooperation. So this is one of the answers. I invite international cooperation agencies to focus or to pay attention to these crises and these type of issues that are usually neglected or that are not that much on the agenda. Also, we are focusing on early childhood development, which is also another issue that is not a top priority when it comes to children on the move. There's much more research, interest, programs, services, etc., on, for example, child protection, the prevention of violence, and on anything that is connected to keeping children alive. So WASH, vaccinations, healthcare, so other topics that are not integrated early childhood development, which is what we are looking at here. I learned a lot from the organizations that I met and that I interviewed in Guatemala, so it is hard to summarize all of the findings, but something that caught my attention and that is connected to research and to the creation of knowledge, which is what we do at the university, is that many organizations identified as an issue the lack of flexible funding directed towards publishing their methodology, their methods, their methodologies, have developing their own monitoring and evaluation frameworks, their own evaluations that are critical evaluations of the work that they do in early childhood development. This coincides or overlaps with research findings in the Latin American context, in the migration context, child migration context, that is that there aren't so many critical evaluations of NGOs, interventions, or programs, and there's more need for that, and more need also for extensive needs assessment. So donors can also focus on this extensive, in-depth needs assessments that have child participation and the participation of families in them. So not only speaking to local organizations or national NGOs, but also speaking to community-based organizations that where the members are also members of the community. So basically their life is interacting with those populations, so reintegrated migrants or people that are at risk of migrating or who are at risk of having to flee their communities, etc. And really taking into consideration their inputs. As we know, we can request feedback and input from children using many methodologies and including many ages of children. What usually ends up happening is that there's more youth participation than child participation. So young children are the ones that are the most neglected in these types of participatory processes. And so that is another topic that donors could pay more attention to. So the participation of children within early childhood, which is from 0 to 8 years old. In our case, we are focusing on children from 0 to 6 and their families. And finally, another need that we identified in Guatemala with the organizations that we interviewed, that of course, thank you very much, everyone who was interviewed by me. They are mentioned in the blog post that we are going to share, is that given that in the Guatemalan context, especially in the highlands and the places where I did field work, there are a large proportion of mothers or caregivers are teenage moms, so adolescent moms. For example, last year in Guatemala, it was something like 70,000 women and girls gave birth who were below the age of 19, so very young mothers. Participatory processes, needs assessments that are based on these participatory approaches need to compulsorily include teenage moms. So teenagers not only as recipients of programs or, you know, citizens that can be actively engaged in improving international cooperation services and initiatives, but also as caregivers and adults who have caregiving responsibilities. So both roles, let's say. And I can continue speaking forever, but I think that those are the main findings that we have.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I really appreciated about your work is how you're kind of breaking down the silos between this focus on women, migrants, and the focus on children. I mean, in real life, like, people don't exist in silos, right? Women are caregivers, they're with children, and you have done a really beautiful job of bringing that together and looking at two-generation approaches, right? That in order to support children on the move, of course, we need to support caregivers, and what kind of programs go together and that are really being mindful about tackling both at the same time. And I also just want to give acknowledgement to the Bainham Family Foundation, which has been supporting Mara's work. And it's also allowing us to create a space to bring the learning from these communities in Guatemala into policy dialogue with global development partners, including USAID and some of the actors on the ground. So Mara's not only doing the research, but she's also facilitating this conversation between research, policy, and practice, which is so exciting. And we want to do more of that. So thank you,
you
Mara,
very
for
much.
leading the way.
Just one more thing.
Sure.
Because this is important. One of the needs identified by a systemic review by ODI and UNICEF last year, which overlaps with our project too, is the need to do evaluations generally that are critical, as I said before, but in particular, I would like to see many more critical evaluations of localization efforts, because by now we must have hundreds of reports on how to do localization, because each and every NGO or multilateral organization has their own report on localization and their methodology and so on and so forth. But it is important to see how these efforts are being actually implemented on the ground. And that is another recommendation for donors also to pool resources if they don't have enough resources themselves, but to pool resources or to collaborate with universities or with other donor organizations to produce this type of evidence. So critical research on, and also critical research also that is easy to read and that is not behind a paywall, because I am sure that in academia this is happening, but the results of that are not diffused and promoted widely so that donors can read it. So easy to read, critical evaluations of localization would be great to know if what we are doing is effective, efficient, and is reaching the children and the families that it needs to reach. So
Right.
final thing, and I will shut up forever.
No,
Sorry.
we like it when you continue. But that's a key point too, right? Like, to what extent do these localization strategies incorporate children? Children are part of local communities, and yet they're often missing from the work that we do on the ground. Yeah. Okay, so now we'll move to Gabriela. Your work has been global, but let's be honest, you have a special place in your heart for the US-Mexico border, which is where you've lived and spent most of your time. And that's a place that, of course, has garnered significant media coverage and has been politicized for decades. And yet you continually reference how so much of the discourse, whether it's happening in research or at the policy level or in the media narratives around migrant activity at the border, excludes the perspective of young people who are crossing the border and maybe also facilitating others crossing, a practice, as you've said, that's sometimes called smuggling. So without including these perspectives of the young people experiencing these movements, the coverage has been partial. It's sometimes led to skewed perceptions and misrepresentations. And some of your work has involved working with teenagers, specifically who are involved in these cross-border movements, to identify the conditions that have led to their participation, and also to provide solutions and reflect on practices that could create more safety for them. So what have you learned from working with these young people specifically? And how can this learning help close the gap between young migrants' lived experience and the political narratives and other narratives that are circulating about them? Thanks.
So thank you so much for that question. And yes, I love the US-Mexico border, and please come over and visit us. I've traveled all over, and I still think that the US-Mexico border is one of the most beautiful places I've ever lived in. But as you just mentioned, one of the main concerns that I have when we talk about children or children on the border is precisely this proliferation of this melodramatic images, right? Of very small children crossing the border or being abandoned, or images of motherhood and mothering that many times are racist and classist, in terms of how women, families, parenthood is represented. I am not saying that people are not vulnerable or that people are not in need of protection. And here I'm just talking mostly about the representations. And that's because those images, generate our pity, but they don't lead us to act. We just feel sorry for the people, right? Oh, I can't believe that they have to go through so much. But that's the level of our engagement. We don't go, as a general public, we may feel sorry for the people, but really don't feel compelled to do much else. And one of along the US-Mexico border, another element that we are faced with is the fact that whenever we talk about migration, it's almost inherent or natural, right, for commentators, for policymakers, for scholars as myself, to immediately connect it to crime. And to come up with all of these images of representations, right, that drug trafficking organizations, have taken over the space, that there's all of these markets that are operating, and that are, creating havoc in along this vast territory. Again, that doesn't mean that violence does not exist. I am really just talking about how all of these messages are circulated and how in that process, we don't really get to hear about the people. And one of my main challenges and concerns whenever I'm invited to talk about the border is trying to get people to think beyond those images of organized crime, beyond the representations of the so-called cartels. I hate that word. We shouldn't be using it, but that's another story. And I think it is, again, that when we only use this designation, that's the only lens that we are using to take a look at what is happening on the ground, we are at risk of obscuring all of this other dynamics. Also, because as a community, and here I'm going to talk about my personal experience, but I refuse that designation. I refuse the designation of, oh, the border is, marginal, or the border, is an inherently violent place where there's only bad people out to get you. Because that is not my community. Our communities along the U.S.-Mexico border have been responding to the humanitarian crisis. They have been providing resources through a lot of the organizations on both sides of the border that gather resources, just people who express their solidarity, but donating their time, their homes, the spaces where we come and get together. So again, as somebody from, who loves the border profoundly, I always try to get people to think beyond that. And for me, that involves looking at the experiences of young people on the border. I think that the U.S.-Mexico border is a place where people are resourceful, yes, they have been marginalized. They are not naturally marginal. Historical inequalities, discrimination, lack of employment, lack of access to education and jobs have created very serious gaps in terms of the ability of people to break patterns, to break cycles of poverty, of discrimination, of being able to just work in a specific markets or fields. And when it comes to young people, the work that I've had the privilege of carrying out in coordination with DIA, this is an NGO on the Mexican side of the border in the city of Ciudad Juárez, that's Derechos Humanos Integrales en Acción, tries precisely to challenge those characterizations from the people of the border. When DIA first started looking at the participation of young people in the facilitation of border crossings, and this was around 2015. I was myself assisting legal teams identify children who have been removed from the border, taken into detention facilities in the interior, especially to the East Coast, with the intention to extract intelligence or information about the activities that they were performing on the border. They were never asked what they wanted to do, if they wanted to stay with their families, if they had access to education, if they had access to medical services, or what they wanted to do with their lives. So, or being able to work alongside DIA, and the work that to this day they continue doing, has involved restoring, and not restoring, but actually creating more of that space, giving more of that space, bringing into the discussion, into the conversation, the perspectives of these young people. And just very kindly shared with us a couple of publications that, with the help of these young people in DIA, we have been able to put together, that actually show what I was telling you, that people who become involved in these kinds of activities don't do it because they are just looking for excitement or because it's cool to be part of a smuggling group. It is also the result of lack of education, lack of opportunities. especially for young people on the border, their knowledge of the geography and the landscape of the rivers, the deserts, the valleys, is something that they can take advantage of, they can profit from. It's also a highly dangerous, very risky activity that leads many of them to sustain injuries. Sadly, as part of the experience in India, we have lost several of our participants, several of our contributors to violence. That comes not only from organized crime, but also from law enforcement, on both sides of the border. So, but what I think, and this is just to close, that I've learned the most from this entire experience is about that, about the strength, the determination, and the refusal of the people from the border to being classified or to being cataloged in a single way. And for that, as part of that process, young people are fundamental.
Thank you so much. So Gabriela does some also really interesting work on, besides all that's published here in the chat that you can see, really helping students think about how to do research with young people who are vulnerable, but also very resourceful and resilient in an ethical way. And I think, that's maybe something we can come back to later in the conversation is, we often are told like, oh, you can't interview children under the age of 18. Which makes sense for a lot of reasons, right? For child protective reasons. And we do a disservice when we don't engage children in that research in a way that's very ethically rigorous. So Gabriela is a great source for thinking about how to do that. And thank you for bringing that learning and those ideas to Georgetown. Okay, so now we'll move to Stephen, who, as you heard earlier, has a really multifaceted background and training in law, social work, experience with child protection implementation in a variety of humanitarian and crisis settings, and also working in New York City with families and working in policy. And in everything you've done, you've centered children and youth. You've often said that every encounter with a child is an opportunity to create healing. And you have insisted that this is also a realistic and possible and important approach in a policy space. You've recently been doing this kind of work with the US Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, to make sure that there are mechanisms in place for young people who've experienced the system going through the Office of Refugee Resettlement to comment on it and to inform how it operates. And you've been key to setting up that link between lived experience as expertise and policy practice. So how can, from what you've learned, like what can you say about how policymakers and government agencies can create those kind of opportunities to really listen to and learn from the young people that they're meant to serve?
Yeah, no, thank you, Gillian. And I just feel so honored, and it's so amazing to listen to Mara, to Gabriela, and I know from Vlad later, like it's so everything just comes together, right? What I'm hearing from Mara, from Gabriela, my experience is we need to walk the talk, right? When we talk about engaging young people, engaging those with lived experience, are we just projecting our own ideas, our own stereotypes, our own classification, our own cataloging, or are we genuinely creating spaces for young people, for those who experience, creating spaces for them to present themselves as they are, in all of the richness, all of their complications, all of their resiliency and the challenges, and that has been a journey for me in the last 25 years, whether as a therapist, a social worker, as a policymaker, whether it's working and navigating the child welfare system in New York City, working with the US government on the southern border, working in post-conflict Liberia, in Pakistan with refugees from Afghanistan. And as Gillian, as you shared, my experience has been that in every interaction with a young person, regardless of its length, 5 minutes, 1 minute, this offers a pathway for connection and learning. And what I want to share, through the eyes of a young person, 7 relational lenses, 7 ways to connect with a young person. The first one, care about me. Show me that I matter to you. What does that mean? Be dependable, respectful, honest, even and especially about uncertainties. Tell me when you don't know. Communicate clearly and inform me of risks so I can make informed decisions. So that's the first one, care about me. The second one, listen to me. Really, really pay attention when we are together. What does this mean? Stay present, attentive, validate my experiences and my emotions. Aim to understand, connect with, and learn from me. The third one, be warm with me. Show me you enjoy being with me. Consistently encourage, support, and praise me. Be patient and, this is key, follow my lead on how to connect. Let me set that relationship, how I want to connect with you. Fourth one, support me. Help me complete tasks and achieve goals. This can be help me plan, set clear boundaries, advocate for me, guide me through challenges, and believe in me. Believe in me. And something I have learned from young people is they can read through BS. They read through BS and so they can see and they can feel it. Believe in me. The fifth one, challenge me to grow. Push me to keep getting better. It's about encouraging me to fulfill my potential and push me beyond my comfort zone. Hold me accountable and help me learn from my successes and our failures. If something I have learned in my 25 years in this work is I constantly make mistakes. I'm deeply, deeply imperfect as a human being. How do we ensure that there are those spaces where we make mistakes and we're given an opportunity to learn from and respond from our mistakes? 6, expand my possibilities. Connect me with people and experiences that broaden my world. Enrich my perspective. Introduce me to new ideas, places, experiences, and mentors. Help me expand my world. And the last one, and a critical one, is share power with me. Respect and empower me. What does this mean? Involve me in decisions, collaborate on solutions, allow me to lead, and honor my narrative and choices. And this goes to what Gabriela and Mara so strongly stated. Let me tell my story the way I want to share my story. That is critical. Recognize and value my contributions. So those are 7 sort of ways of connecting with a young person that are based in terms of the 25 years I've been doing this work and from others who've worked on this. And I think ultimately it's a space where we generally need to be in that space where we're listening to, genuinely listening, meeting young people where they are, unconditionally accepting what they share with us, their feelings. And that is what then opens it up for engaging and for a relationship. But this is critical in everything we do. And it doesn't matter whether you're a grant maker, whether you're a policy maker, whether you're right directly working with a child, every opportunity, every interaction, it's that way that you engage with. You don't speak great Spanish, but you try to speak in Spanish. You maintain eye contact, you engage, you let them know, I see you. And I see you as you are. I see you as you want to be seen, as you want to be presented. I am not representing anyone. I honestly hate this whole thing. We represent children. No, what we should be doing is creating spaces, elevating spaces for young people, for children, for parents to present themselves as they are. And what that requires from us is to give up our projections, our sanitized comfort zones, and to be comfortable in discomfort and to be challenged in those ways and to ultimately share power, because ultimately that's what helps us all globally. That's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you. So I love it when you listen to Stephen, you know, you think, okay, he's a social worker, he's sounding like a therapist. But what's very cool is when you see him apply that same stuff to policy spaces, because it is the same principles. If we're actually serious about child participation and lived experience as expertise, I mean, are we as policymakers, as people on Capitol Hill or at USAID or at the UN, are we prepared to do things differently and to be changed because of what we've heard from the people that we say we're serving? So it's really, you're really humbling when you actually, you know, and you do that with us too as a team, right? Like, you know, hang on, we're not just a university producing research and this kind of thing. We're actually, are we serious about what we're saying about lifting up the children with lived experience first? Thank you, Stephen. Okay, over to Kiev. Vlad, I just want to give a special shout out to Vlad because as he's been with us in the midst of war, he has joined meetings after, you know, while air sirens are going off after his neighbor's apartment has been bombed. And he consistently shows up because of his commitment to making sure that the stuff that he's working on is actually visible to the world. It's so inspiring. I mean, you're truly doing emergency research, and it's an honor to have seen you in the midst of this, and your courage and tenacity. And so before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you were primarily working as a research historian and a seminarian, religious scholar, looking at the history of the Soviet mass deportation of Ukrainians. And then, as you mentioned in your opening comments, you became aware that history was repeating itself and that the Russians were actually once again, in a very coordinated, organized, systematic way, deporting Ukrainian civilians, many of whom were children. And we don't know the exact numbers. The documented official numbers are 20,000, but as you've said, it could be up to 150 or more. So this is the largest missing children's case since World War II. And you are really on the front lines of making this crisis known to the world. There's a lot to say about how the international community has not mobilized around this. And a lot of the work is being truly led by Ukrainian researchers like you and civil society partners. So you're really doing emergency research. So what is at stake as you do this, and how can your work be supported? What do you guys need to continue and to get the support from the international community that you need?
Thank you, Gillian, for this question. It's an honor to me to be a part of this comment. And I just want to say about introduction, about historical background of this criminal process, what Russia do right now, because why I still doing this investigation? Because a forcible deportation of children and a forcible deportation of children and adults people from Ukraine, it's not a new phenomenon, it's not a new practice, because maybe you ever heard about speech of President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, that he said that broken out of Soviet regime, for him it's a problem, but he still doing Soviet crimes, because we know from a Soviet period that at least in, for example, in 1930, 1931, from Ukrainian, especially lands, to Siberia, deported more than 130 persons. It's villagers from Ukraine. And after that, Soviet regime deported from 4 waves more than 1,133 people. It's in Soviet period. And for example, I could explain about deportation of children from Baltic states, for example, from Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, when Soviet KGB regime deported these children to Siberia, they grow up in Siberia places, and Soviet regime try to erase their identity, try to erase their nationality. That's why it's so dangerous. And as an historian, I understand that Russia doing the same practice right now. After full-scale invasion, just before full-scale invasion in Ukraine started 24 February 2022. But we know about in 19 February that Russian soldiers forcibly deported people from occupied Luhansk region to Rostov region in Russia. After that, when they occupied new Ukrainian land, they every day deported children from these occupied territories. From our investigation, we know that at least 50, 60 places, location, it's named temporary accommodation centers in territory of Russian Federation, where they in these places they deported children from Ukraine, and nobody knows who are these children, because we have no information about these children. We know that at least 100,000 children are forcibly removed from Ukraine to Russia, but identified children only 19,546, and returned to home just 388. It's a very dangerous situation, because when we try to come back these children to home, it could be many years, but we have no this time, because every day after deportation, it's not an end of process of this criminal process, because after deportation, when these children stay in this location in territory of Russia, every day Russia government try to Russify and militarize these children. We know about a different paramilitary organization in the territory of Russia. For example, Young Army movement of First Eagles of Russia. And in this paramilitary organization, they try to erase identity of Ukrainian children. And especially boys, they try to put boys, teenagers, to paramilitary forces, doing with them especially military lessons. And after that, they try to create a future mobilization sources to Russian army. And we know about one of these cases. I tell this for our colleagues, for example, about a teenager. He's named Anatoly. He grown up in occupied Donetsk. Donetsk occupied from 2014. And after that, he put to Russian army. It's Ukrainian young man, but he fighting against Ukraine. It's a dangerous situation, because for a pity, right now he has no Ukrainian identity, and it's dangerous situation for us. And what international society could help to us? It's a very big part of work, because just a few organizations are investigating this process, and we should reload and improvement international system of children care, especially for Ukraine, because, for example, when we try to identify Ukrainian children, just only International Committee of Red Cross, just UNICEF could have some information about children who are in Russian territory, because Ukrainian society and Ukrainian government have no deeply information about these children. And when we have no information of these children, it's so hard to return these children to home. And that's why it's so important to us to have international support in this problem. And it's especially important to have support from international universities, international funding, because for example, in Ukraine, just a few organizations are every day still doing this investigation. And it's so hard because just a few organizations doing this process, but a lot of evidence, a lot of children. And we have no so much resources for that, you know. And that's why it's so important to support this investigation, because we not have so much time to return these children to home. And if we could immediately return these children to home, if we could create unifying return these children to home, it's a main topic for us. And that's why it's so important to us.
Thank you, Vlad. Yeah, the connection was cutting a little bit at the end, but we got most of it. So thank you so much. I think you might have frozen, actually. I think it's so important to say that what Vlad is working on, forcible deportation of children under the Genocide Convention, is an act of genocide. And thanks to the work that Vlad and other colleagues are doing, it has been recognized as genocide in the European Parliament, for instance. And actually, our Congress in the United States just passed a resolution a few weeks ago also recognizing this as an act of genocide. But it's going to be impossible to prosecute war crimes without the research and the data. So what Vlad is doing in coordination with other civil society partners is also informing the Office of the General Prosecutor, the International Criminal Court. So this work is really like frontline human rights research and life-saving, hopefully. And I would also say it's primarily not funded. He's doing a lot of this work because he's a Ukrainian who cares about his population. And the international community is not funding to the extent that it could the research and the work to document this and respond to it. So, and I would also just like to point out that he's been extraordinarily collaborative. I mean, it was Vlad and his team who reached out to Georgetown to say, can we be part of this work? They organized a webinar in July last year when nobody was talking about this. And he has since coordinated with the State Department, with the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, with other universities, for instance, students at Hamilton College who are interested in learning how to use the open source intelligence work to help the cause. Vlad has really been coordinating a lot of that. So truly collaborative process and spirit. And it's an honor to watch you mobilize and get it done. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's get back into conversation mode. You're all innovators. You're all on the kind of cutting edge of this work, because this is an emerging field. Like when I was a student, there was no opportunity to learn about how to do child-centered research or child-centered policy or child-centered practice. We were kind of winging it and learning along the way. So I'll just ask you guys for some reflections. What are the challenges and opportunities in doing this work at this sort of place and time? And what do students and early career professionals need to do to prepare to engage in this kind of work? What would you tell your younger self if you were a student or an early career professional? Thoughts? Gabriela? I'll call on you because I know you have good reflections on this.
Why me? Why me? No, especially, because the last question I know, and here I'm going to out Stephen, but that came from him. What would I have told myself? As a migrant, as somebody who arrived to the U.S. as a teenager, I would remind myself, I will tell people, that those experiences, that what we went through, what we experienced, coming in, or staying, or spending time in detention, having to adjust our status, having to do all of this, things that many times, were probably not necessarily licit. All of that is your story, and at the same time, it matters. I think that I remember being told at some point when I applied for a fellowship, that the person who was coordinating and saying, is like, but you're a migrant. You really don't have, I don't know why you want to study migrants. And not having anybody in my family who had a college education, I remember thinking, like, maybe she's right. Maybe I shouldn't. This is not my place. And I learned how important it is to create those spaces for us. As you were saying, Leah, when I know that that there was, not a lot of the work that I do, I never got specific training for it. It was nothing like, there was not a class on migrant smuggling, or there was not a class on migration related crimes. But it was, I was always trying to find allies, and also to create my many cases, my own spaces to do this kind of research. This involved many times not necessarily listening to the first opinion that I received by, from professors, or again, from advisors. I was given many times wrong information about the research process. And so looking for other opinions, looking for other researchers who are doing similar work, or looking for people who are probably outside of academia, not doing necessarily that work, but who can give you insights in terms of how to build those spaces. I think that again, something that has been along borders for me, on borders around the world, people always accommodate you. People always find spaces for you. So being able to recognize that, and not being afraid, not being scared of looking again for all of these spaces, takes time, but can be done.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on one of those questions? I mean, you can broaden it too. I mean, what could universities do to help prepare people for this kind of work? I mean, one of the things we say, some people say we're the collaborative on global children's issues. And so some people say, well, what are global children's issues? And our response is often, well, what aren't global children's issues? I mean, if you think about it, children and youth comprise 40% of the global population. So any challenge that's facing the world is, of course, affecting children, and sometimes in really unique ways. But we're not necessarily trained to think about the ways those things affect children, right? I mean, you can go through an education on, focusing on climate change and never think about the specific impacts of climate change on young people. So what do universities need to do to make sure that our curriculum is also child-centered, or includes a child-centered focus?
If I can speak. So Joan made the question, and I was going to cite Joan, so full circle. On her Q&A for the website, she explains that being a child advocate is not someone else's responsibility. It calls on all of us to keep the best interest of children and families in mind in our work. And it is connected to what you have just said. We live in extremely unequal, unfair societies where many times the burden of these inequalities and injustices fall on children. And we can see that because there's a lot of empiric evidence for that. So I would say that to students, even if you end up not working in international cooperation, not working in human rights, it doesn't matter what you do really. It is important that you contribute to making societies more equal, just, fair, and democratic, because that is the way to make sure that children's rights are fulfilled. A lot of why children's rights are violated has to do with wider societal injustices, racism, machismo in our countries, patriarchy, etc., colonization, etc. So wider social phenomena. And I think it is important that each of us, it doesn't matter what we do, you don't need to be a children's rights advocate officially to care about making societies more just and friendlier and fairer for children. So I like that reflection a lot.
Thanks. Yeah. Vlad, what would you say? I mean, you're here, well, all of you are working on really critical emergency issues in a sense, whether it's migration, kids at the border. What would you say? I mean, we don't often think about research as an emergency humanitarian response, especially child-focused research. So what would you say? What do we need to do as a university or maybe donors? What can we do to make the kind of work that you're doing easier or more visible?
Yes, when war is started in Ukraine, I'm just thinking about how my academician background could be most useful, helpful for our country, for helping to fighting for their freedom. And it's a main issues for me and for my colleagues, researchers from Ukraine. And after that, you should remember when you started this difficult investigation about especially war crimes against children, about children cares in war situation, in a country who are under bombing, who are under war crimes. You should remember that it's most important work for you, because you should save a next generation of your people, next generation of your society, a future of your country. And that's why it's most important for us. And for our academician colleagues, it could be very important too, because it's, if we discuss today, it's largest mass deportation after Second World War. And these cases are important for all over the world, because it's most difficult deportation from last 80 years. And if we talking about some support, we should have a lot of collaboration with different international university, with funding and donors, because if we have this support, we could do a lot of work. We could involve to our work more people, more researchers, more sources to investigate this problem. Especially, you should have specialized knowledge. You should learning OSINT, for example, OSINT skills, and some of these courses are not for free, for example, but you should know this information, because when you want to investigate sensitive information about children, you should know these skills, and that's why you should have sources for that. You should have a lot of comments, a lot of participants in your comments, especially professional researchers, because you should have a good academician background, because every day you should read a lot of sources, lot of information, and you should have skills how to separate important information, not important information, what information could be useful for example, for share to international society, what information are sensitive and couldn't be shared to publicly, but you should collect this information to improve, for example, war crimes against some of Russian persons, to improve international sanctions against Russian persons who are involved in process of deportation. And that's why you should have a source to do all of these things. And that's why you should have collaboration with different partners.
I mean, it's been fascinating watching Vlad work because, of course, much of this data that he's working with is extremely sensitive. And sometimes, if it's made public, that can put the children who've been deported at even more risk. They can be taken from where they are and moved again. So starting the process all over again to try to document them. So this, there are a lot of volunteers working on this research, but it's extremely technically sophisticated. And understanding how to do that and do it well is so important. And it takes resources to protect data, to create secure servers, especially when there are researchers working from all over the world and trying to combine. So sharing data is so critical. It's fascinating and underdeveloped. I mean, we have to do more and better for sure to advance this work. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up also for the audience. So audience, if you have any questions for the fellows, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But do any of you want to reflect on, I mean, the collaborative, being part of the collaborative doesn't give you tons of resources. It doesn't make you rich, right? Nobody gets rich doing this kind of work. But what does it do? What does being part of the collaborative, how does it help your work? Anybody want to mention?
If I can share, I mean, I think it's connected to everything that we've heard earlier from Gabriela, Vlad, and Mara just now. The collaborative is the space where it's a space of encounter, of interconnection, of all the ways we're connected and entangled with each other. I think as we've all experienced, the four of us work in related but different types of areas of work, different ways of engaging, and yet we're all connected and visibilizing. And I think what the collaborative does is it visibilizes and elevates the spaces where this conversation are taking place. It's breaking down those silos, as you earlier mentioned, Gillian, because as you also said, in real life, we don't exist in silos, right? As Mara was and Gabriela were so strongly, we are not monolithic creatures. We're not, no one is. And when we project that onto others, we're losing the essence of who we are, the essence and the opportunity to connect and engage with each other. And for me, that's what the collaborative is a space that elevates, that visibilizes, that connects and interconnects, and that hopefully also, when I think of my younger self and thinking about, as I went into this work, is the collaborative in many ways encapsulates it, the sense of networking, of relationships, right? It's all the relationships. And if I can give any advice to any young professionals or students who are thinking about it, is relationships. Connect with people, reach out to people. And also it's a space where you need to be comfortable with discomfort. You need to also be aware of yourself, the self-awareness about who you are, your own biases that you're bringing into it, and being open with humility that you don't have all the answers, that we are all imperfect. And it's about getting in, engaging in that space, being brave to jump into that space that can be messy, complicated, and open. And, to this day, I constantly, at every level, I'm constantly learning. I'm making mistakes, and it's just having that openness to always learn, and through a lens of humility. So that's what I have experienced with the collaborative, and it's just a really unique way of engaging and encountering and expanding and really expanding itself. And the last thing I'll share is also through a space of hope. I really think my experience with this work is it has to come from hope. I think I always think about Hannah Arendt and how she said that in every birth, there's hope, there's a new opportunity. And I think that especially in the times where we live, and that's I've always learned from the young people, children, families, parents I work with. It's hope is that what's so essential in our lives, and that which gives us, and that which it can really guide us and motivate us, and it has to be from a space of hope while being realistic in terms of all the challenges. But that's my experience.
Thanks, Stephen. Anybody else want to chime in on any of the other reflections?
What you mentioned before about innovation, that the collaborative gives space to topics that are a little bit neglected or that don't receive as much attention by international cooperation. And that is really important. And that is another advice that I have for students, to follow their interests, even if they are niche or no one cares about that. I wrote my thesis on decolonization more than 10 years ago. And now it became a little bit, it is not hegemonic yet, but there are many more organizations speaking about decolonization and publishing about this than before. So I encourage them very much to pursue their true interests. So like what Bradislav did for Ukraine, Gabriela has done based on her experience as a migrant. You can also take your experiences, even if you think that they are not important, and turn them into your work. And that is a huge contribution that you can make to your people or to your community.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I would also say is that, well, we had a graduate student last year who did a scrub of the curriculum to see kind of how are we preparing people going into the Foreign Service, for instance, to think about the global challenges from the lens of children and youth. And she came from a gender studies background, women's studies. And after she did this scrub, she said, oh my God, we're doing to children what we used to do to women. They're just not there. And I thought that was really interesting, you know. And so sometimes, you know, when you work with children, especially as a woman, people are like, oh, that's cute. You know, working with children is cute. It's soft, it's sweet. And you're like, no, I mean, when you listen to Vlad or listen to Gabriela, does that sound soft or sweet? I mean, they're working on the toughest issues of the world with extra sensitivity because it involves children. So that's like the rigor that goes into doing good work on behalf of children is extraordinary. And yet many of us are going into those fields not being trained. So, you know, in some ways, doing this work feels like I'm satisfying the 25-year-old me, you know, who had the job with the UN in wartime Angola, feeling really prepared and really grateful to have this work until I started working with child soldiers. And then thought, oh my goodness, in all of my great education and fabulous training, nothing prepared me for this. And so I feel like, you know, Stephen, when you talk about like, what would you tell your younger self? It's like, okay, notice what's missing in the world of your training, of your practice, of your field, of your, you know, and maybe in 25 years, you'll be able to correct that or create that space. So for me, it's a huge joy to be with people who are like, oh yes, we want to fill that gap and stand in the space. So there was a question in the chat. How would you recommend nonprofit organizations working with immigrant children and youth under traditional social service protocols to create spaces and systems within their programming to establish authentic and ethical partnerships with children and youth and help to elevate their voices and lived experiences? Anyone want to take that?
May I say something?
Yeah.
We asked them. I think that I recognize the fact that, again, having witnessing, you know, a lot of the challenges that come with welcoming and receiving children, young people and families, and the vast number of needs that they have, that it is very difficult to sit down and actually, ask one-on-ones like what they actually need or want. But I think that we need to carve the time. We really need to create those spaces, because if not, I think that especially along the US-Mexico border, most of the organizations are prepared to receive people and to see them leave right away. So there is really not a lot of engagement with other than attending to the most basic needs, at that point. Do you have clothes? Do you have shoes? Do you have a place to get to? Do you have their phone number with you? But I think it also involves starting to build those relationships, keeping in touch with people. Where do they go? What are the needs that they have once they reach a specific destination? For those, I know that again, in the context of the US-Mexico border is very, the vast majority of people are going to leave. But for those who decide to stay, or for those who decide to stay in contact, what would have worked for you? What would you have liked to see? And start investing on that too. I think that many times I see that in my own work. Sometimes I'm like, if I could just have the clarity of mind to sit down and to prepare and to think about all of these elements, I think we could create that. But it also, again, as Stephen was saying, listen to what they have to say, and let them come as they are, because that's many times the other challenge, right? That, oh, it's a little child. We infantilize them, and these are kids who already travel by their on their own. They cross the Darien, they came all the way from Guatemala, Honduras, West Africa. They have seen half of the world, and we're still telling them how they should tie their shoes or what they should eat. So again, I think in engaging them at that level and making a deep, committed investment into what they would like to see is essential.
And I just want to add on to what Gabriela's saying, because some people say, well, but we don't have enough time. We only see them for this. I think every encounter is that opportunity. And when we talk about it, it's asking, right? I remember this experience talking with then she was 16 years old. She crossed the border pregnant, and she still remembers the encounter with the border patrol person who found her, and that 5-minute encounter where he in Spanish gave her a bottle of water, gave her information. This is what's going to happen to you over the next hour. That space, and she still remembers that experience, that encounter that lasted a few minutes with this person, and that stayed with her. And I think that too many times we just, we forget that, it's every moment you connect, every moment you engage, and it's about seeing that person. It's about sharing information. Information is power. And we don't realize, or we feel like, no, I can't tell this, as Gabriela just said, this child, I can't tell them that it's going to be really hard to find their mother. I'm going to come up with a sweet lie and tell them, oh, we're still looking, oh, we don't know. This child crossed the border on themselves. The issue here is you can't handle having an uncomfortable conversation. So I think it's important, and it's not easy. So how do you have those conversations? But don't project, our own discomforts onto others. And really from this space of like, we really need to change the way we walk. And that starts with humility, and that starts with self-awareness, and that starts with and even within huge bureaucracies, whether it's the US government, like, yes, things you can change systemically and absolutely, but you don't need to wait to start acting in a way that sees the young person, the parent, the person as a human being, right? And that is felt. Those are all the nonverbal ways we communicate, the ways that we show our distracted. There's the way we just like, there is every sentence, your face, your body, your voice, everything communicate. We're constantly communicating. Unconsciously conscious, we're beings, we're social beings. We're born into this world to connect. A baby learns how to be themselves through connection. And if we remind ourselves, and connection is intersubjective, it's both in terms of the ways that I'm influenced and I influence others. And as long as we're open to this idea that we each impact, no matter what role we play, what lens we come in from, we're always communicating with each other. And I think that's a really important starting point of sorts.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. Why don't we each spend 1 minute to say what you're hopeful about in this field of child-centered research, policy, or practice? Where are we headed as a field? It's a new field. It's a new discipline in a sense. So what are you excited about? Sorry, catching you on the spot. I'm excited that universities are beginning to notice that this is a field of practice and that we have more to do, and they're creating spaces for it.
I'm excited that there is that as the migrant population continues to grow, more people, with migrant backgrounds become involved in the decisions that are made around programming, but also within research and policy.
Yeah, so from my side, like I said before, the issue of coloniality within international development is becoming more popular, so as to say, and that gives me a lot of hope because, as Gabriela said, I also agree that leadership positions should be occupied by people with lived experiences, basically in the global south or by migrants, etc., refugees, women, survivors of gender-based violence, etc. So that makes me hopeful. And the second thing is what you mentioned before, that children's rights, child issues is becoming a more critical area of study, and that will most probably help us move away from charity-based perspective, approaches and paternalistic approaches. Children are like some cute type of topic that only women care about, and these more traditional approaches that are useless. So those two things make me hopeful.
And from my side, I want to add that it's an honor to me that children cares and children rights, especially children rights in war, became a new discipline, maybe in future for different researcher and universities. And for example, life stories of Ukrainian children, especially, it's could be shared to international society. We have no chance before war to have this chance, but right now I hope it could be useful and it could be effective to help children care for Ukrainian children and for other children all over the world in this experience to have a new level of children protections.
Thanks.
And I'm hopeful because I do genuinely believe and experience that there's so much more that connects us than we sometimes experience when we look at the media and all the ways, all those different silos of vitriol, and for me it comes down to there's sort of I guess 4 parts to this. One is this space. I think what I've experienced when there's hope in me is when we see the other, when we accept. I accept you as you are. I accept the feelings. I unconditionally accept the feelings you share with me. I accept your story as your story. And it doesn't mean we agree with a story. It means that we see that person. I see you. I see if this is something that makes you that you experience this way, then I can see why you're so upset. So it's about acceptance connected with empathy. We are all, again, on a human level, we're so much more. As much as we try to make ourselves unique and this, bigotry of different small differences, there's so much more that we are similar than different in terms of the essence of our human essence, and engaging with empathy, with recognizing and seeing, I see how hard this is. I see that this is not easy. And with curiosity, it goes back to what Gabriela said. I want to learn about you. I want you to teach me about you and how I can see you, support you. And the last thing for me, it's so essential that joy be a part of that conversation, that hope and joy because I feel that that's what is so essential in life, and that so many times we miss, even in the midst of the most challenging circumstances, finding hope, feeling hope and joy, and it's through others that we most times experience that. So
Amen to that. Thank you for bringing that hope and that joy daily, honestly, to the work that we're doing here. And I want to give again a shout out to Joan Lombardi, who conceived of this and especially made a point to make sure we were learning from the fields and creating this fellowship opportunity. And to Ian Manzi, who is also behind the scenes and a key part of our team, also bringing real lived experiences, expertise into this work, and also academic rigor and a collaborative spirit. I say that's the most incredible thing about all of you, is the way that you show up in this space with truly collaborative spirits, lifting each other up, lifting up the work, finding ways to connect dots and grow stronger as a team, but also this field of practice. So we'll end the webinar here, but the conversation and the work, of course, continue. And thanks for everything.